It was not very like the disciples to do much of anything on their own initiative. And when they did, as often as not, they got it wrong. Think of Peter cutting off the ear of a man in the Garden of Gethsemane. Today we are told by St. John that when evening came, as the sun was setting and everyone else was enjoying their evening meal, our friends, the disciples, decided to put to sea. Jesus has left them after the melee prompted by his feeding of 5,000 people with 5 loaves and 2 fish. He was smart. He was not about to let the adoring crowd determine his fate. He knew how fickle a crowd could be. And so he slipped through the bushes and back up a hillside to a secret place, hidden from even his own followers. I wonder, what put it into their heads to get in the boat as night was falling? They wanted to get to Capernaum. Perhaps they had already discussed with Jesus that this was going to be the next stop. And yes, some of them were fishermen and not unfamiliar, I suppose, with handling a boat during the darker hours of the day. Whatever their reasoning, they don't really, to me at least, seem to be acting on instructions from Jesus. They seem to once again be making it up as they go along. And St. John gives us what to me is one of the really wonderfully evocative phrases of all of Scripture. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. Start with the dark. We all know that even in broad daylight or with the lights blaring, we can be in the dark. It's dark if you are one of the millions of Americans who is unemployed. It's dark if you're having trouble figuring out how your savings and Social Security are going to pay your bills. It's dark if you've run out of ways to shuffle around your debt. It's dark when the sharp pain of a loved one's death has turned into a dull throb that you fear will never go away. It's dark when you wake up in the morning and you cannot think of a reason or find the energy to get out of bed. You could name other ways, a whole multitude of them, that it's dark in the middle of the day, when despair eclipses hope, options have narrowed, you squint your eyes but still see no light at the end of the tunnel. The dark is not a time of day, it is a state of being. And sometimes it seems as though we must constantly adapt to the darkness, so much so that we seem to become quite adept at being nocturnal creatures who can operate just fine in the dark. Why did the disciples get into the boat when it was dark? They don't know where Jesus is. The crowd, which continues to look for Jesus the next day, is confused for a while because they know the disciples left without him. Were they forging on ahead, preparing the way? Or were they making something of a getaway? Frightened by the power of his signs and his refusal to respond to the awe of the crowds, are they having second thoughts about following this guy? Are they frightened when they see Jesus on the water? At least in part because he has found them out and caught them as they were trying to make their escape. It was dark after all, and maybe they thought they could get away with it. Have they decided that they prefer the darkness to the light? Who knows? but we do know what it feels like to be in the boat in the dark without Jesus. We know what it feels like when the seas become rough because a strong wind is blowing. We know that these are not just maritime conditions, but also states of being. It was now dark. Jesus had not yet come to them. We know what that feels like. And it doesn't really matter whether we are running away of our own accord or if we have simply found ourselves in the boat in rough seas. What matters in the moment is that it is now dark, and Jesus has not yet come to us. Now take note that it is not the weather that frightens the disciples, although it is getting rough. Rather, it is the appearance of Jesus in the midst of this plan of their own devising that terrifies them. Now, of course, he shouldn't be walking to them on the water. It's a bit unsettling. But they might have been amazed and glad to see their teacher performing such a great sign. Yet they weren't. Their fear is a signal. Though they do not recognize it at the time, it is a signal that they are in the presence of the living God. Throughout Scripture, fear not, those words are a colloquialism for just this. But they don't know what their fear signifies. They were impressed with the bread and the fish, but they don't know what it meant. And so perhaps they had been hoping for some time on their own in Capernaum to talk it over amongst themselves, to decide if they really want to follow this Jesus who resists the support of the very crowds he so excites. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. Not a time of day, rather a state of being. And into that state of being, Jesus strides across the rough surface of the sea. It is I, he says, do not be afraid. And St. John gives us two more wonderful, important details. First, he tells us that eventually the disciples want to take Jesus in the boat with them. They are finally willing to incorporate Jesus into their plans, to take him with them wherever it is they are going. Now, when Matthew and Mark tell this story, the whole point of it is that Jesus gets into the boat with them. It's a great sermon, rather easy to preach. But here in John's gospel, Jesus never gets into the boat. All John tells us is that the disciples eventually decide that they would have invited him in. Second, John tells us that once they have decided it will be okay to include Jesus in this nighttime excursion of theirs, then they find themselves delivered immediately to where they were headed. Their destination reached, their objective accomplished. And now they can get on with their work. St. John knows that none of this is about the weather or the time of day. John knows it is about a state of being. And he knows that when it is dark and the seas are rough, a strong wind blowing, many of us are not prepared to let Jesus into the boat, even if he should walk on the water to get to us. We claim our faith in that moment when we decide we want to take Jesus into the boat with us. For in that moment, our state of being changes. The plan we hatched on our own is turned over to Jesus. The time of day and the conditions hardly matter. And we discover that we have arrived at our destination. 1,000 darknesses descend on our lives, shrouding our vision in shadows regardless of the time of day. And we well know what it feels like when it is dark and Jesus has not yet come to us. What plans of our own devising are we in the midst of when we realize it is dark? Have we really meant to include Jesus in those plans? Are we going on ahead of him? Or are we maybe really trying to make our escape from this man who, while admittedly impressive with loaves and fishes, well, leaves us feeling a bit uneasy? Are we wearing the name tag of a disciple uncomfortably, uncertainly? And do we think maybe that if we could get away from him for a night and talk it over with one another, that we might actually come up with another, easier plan? Is it just easier for us to move about in the dark? Have we become so very adept at it that it seems like the best time to make our move? Earlier in his gospel, St. John allows that some of us would just as soon allow the darkness to be our natural habitat. He writes, "Light has come into the world, and people loved darkness rather than light." It is now dark. We start in the dark. We have plans of our own that so often do not include Jesus, have not considered him, have not considered the claim he makes on our lives. And often we believe that we can handle the boat even though it's dark and a strong wind is blowing. And we may even be right about that some of the time. But Jesus does come to us, comes striding across the rough waters of our lives. If it is frightening, we shouldn't be surprised. This is a signal that we are in the presence of the living God. Maybe, just maybe, Jesus is going to get into the boat with us and calm the storm. It has been known to happen. But maybe he is waiting for us to decide that we want him with us in the first place. And maybe that is enough. Maybe the words of invitation need never even be uttered. Maybe all that's needed is wanting Jesus in the boat, choosing in our heart to have him with us, preferring the light to the darkness. When we make that choice, we should not be surprised that our small goals are easily accomplished as we arrive immediately at our destination and hear Jesus calling us to help him get on with God's good work.